Hello, and welcome to the first module, which may actually get broken up into parts, I'm not sure, of the Delaware CTR Excel training series on community engagement and research. I'm really glad you're here. My name is Allison Carpin, and I am a co-lead in the Community Engagement and Outreach Core. So over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through some of the foundations of community engaged research. We're going to talk about what it is, where it came from, some of the ethics that guide it, and some other practical considerations that you might want to think about when you're putting together your proposal or even just thinking about the way you do science. The subtitle on this slide, Nothing About Us Without Us, is something that I want you to think about. It's really a phrase that means a lot to our Community Advisory Council members, something that has been really an overarching guiding view of how we do our work. And it's a phrase that we'll come back to throughout this set of presentations. It captures the idea of our central commitment to the people that are most affected by a research question, really having a meaningful voice in how that research gets done. So with that, let's get started. So here's how we're going to spend our time together. We have 6 sections planned for today. First, we're going to start by situating the community engagement within the Delaware CTR Excel's mission, talking a little bit about why this matters to translational research in Delaware specifically. We're also then going to define a little bit more what we mean by community, and we're going to look at engagement as a continuum because we know that there's a wide range of different kinds of practices here, and that whether you're a bench scientist or someone who's really deeply involved in community work from the start, there's a lot of different ways you can engage in community engaged research. Section 3 will cover 2 foundational methodologies that you will see referenced most often. These are really the foundations of the field. Community-based participatory research, or CBPR as we call it, and participatory action research, otherwise known as PAR or PAR. Section 4 will be about ethics. We're going to spend some time here because it is a core that we focus on ethics, and the standard Belmont framework was designed really for individual research subjects, and there's some emerging evidence that community engaged research should ask us to really widen our lens. Section 5 is some practical things. We'd like to share with you more about informed consent and privacy, training and community partner work, and a little bit more about disseminating results. We're also going to close with some resources here that you can tap into right away as part of our ACCEL CTR program or through our partners. So let's get started. So this module and the broader Delaware CTR program is funded by an Institutional Development Award, or called an IDEA, from the National Institute of General Medical Sciences at the NIH. Our grant number is U54GM104941, and we appreciate it if you cite this moving forward in other work. We also do receive generous support from the state of Delaware and the University of Delaware, Christiana Care, Nemours Children's Health, and Delaware State University are all partners. The Delaware CTR Excel logo is also a federally registered service mark. On the contributor side, this content was developed by the Delaware CTR Excel Community Engagement and Outreach Core, which is a group of about 5 to 8 individuals represented by each community-based institution, or I guess educational-based institution in our network. And we also have had input from our Community Advisory Council members, as well as from Delaware State University's Institute for Health Equity Research. We've also drawn substantially from the CITI program module, which you can also take, which is on ethical and practical considerations, which is by Cadbury, Winkler, Senjupta, and Bernstein, Brugge, and Briere, and was published in 2018. Whenever you see specific guidance or a specific concept later in the module, we also have provided the source cited at the bottom of the slide, so you can go back to it there. Let's start by grounding ourselves in why the CTR really exists. We have 3 aims, and community engagement is a core foundation that runs through all of them. So first, the goal is to build these opportunities, to build the infrastructure, to build the scientific culture that will allow outstanding investigators to do clinical and translational research that will really seek to impact the diverse healthcare needs of our community and ensure that everyone has access to being participants in research and engaging with the understandings that we learn from our research. Second, we seek to train. Our goal is to recruit and develop clinicians and scientists across the state whose research programs consider the needs of all members of our community and to support them in the training needs that they have. Third, we seek to engage. Our goal is to expand and enhance community engagement and outreach through research programs that work directly with the state of Delaware and other stakeholders that promote health and wellness across our population. Community engaged research isn't just a specialty within the Delaware CTR, but really it's the goal of how we do the best research we can across all these different elements. So before we go too much further, I really want to take a minute to define some terms. So what do we mean when we say community? The principle on the left is the one that we want to really anchor on, this idea of nothing about us without us. Because that phrase comes out of our disabilities rights advocacy in the 1990s, it really does make a strong claim where decisions about a group should not be made without the participation of that group. So in a research context, this really means that we're seeking to get the broad expertise, ideally including the voices and lived experience of the people who are most effective, so that we can improve our scientific rigor, we can improve our research relevance, and we can really improve the potential for translational impact down the line. So for the formal definition, ACCEL defines a community as a group of people with diverse characteristics linked by social or professional ties and who share common perspectives, interests, or health concerns. These are all people who have been or might be willing to engage in joint action. This does not necessarily mean then that we're only talking about a specific community member, say in a neighborhood. Instead, it does refer to other groups of community members, such as a community of practitioners or a community of stakeholders that might include policymakers and so forth. It's really important that you think about who your community of focus is and who the research intends to impact. So this doesn't say a neighborhood, it doesn't say a specific ethnic group. Our communities are really a variety of patients who could be those with rare disease who connect through a Facebook group, or a community could be a clinical patient who comes through a particular clinic to share something. They could also be a workplace, a faith community, or a school. And the health concerns that bind a community together aren't only necessarily physical. They can also be environmental or social, emotional, mental, or cultural. So our working definition is much broader than people might assume. As you think about your own research, you might want to ask, which community is this for? And then ask, am I in conversation with that community? So as we move now into starting to get into some more formal frameworks, I just want to start to contextualize this conversation a little bit more. So let's slow down and let community members speak. These are some composite quotes that are drawn from the community engagement literature. And these are the kind of things that, quite frankly, come up over and over when academic researchers and community members often sit together and talk about the realities of this work. So the first one is helicopter research. A quote from the community is that they flew in, they took our personal information, and then they just took off. We never really got anything back. So this is a community member describing a researcher who showed up, who extracted what they needed, they published, and then they disappeared. The community really feels like they got nothing. They got no findings, they got no follow-up, and they really have no ongoing relationship. The second is the concern of misaligned priorities. Here's the quote. The academics got a grant for reducing smoking. But what we're really concerned with is not smoking, it's gun and gang violence. The research is technically about the community, but it's not really about what the community is actually losing sleep over. Third, I titled Already Knew. Quote, did they need to do that big long study to prove what we around here already knew? That's the community saying that you spent 3 years and $1 million confirming something that we could have told you in just 1 week, and you really didn't ask. Fourth, the idea that trust takes time. Quote, the professor just can't walk in expecting a partnership. It really takes time to understand each other and to make sure that we won't be exploited. Partnership is certainly not a form that we fill out. We know that it's built over time through trusting long-term relationships. Fifth is sustainability. The university implemented a really nice program, but then the money ended and the program ended right along with it. We know that grant cycles can be 2, 3, 5 years. The community lives there, however, forever. And so that means that when you leave, how can you think about what actually will stay? So I want you to try and hold these voices in mind as we move through the rest of this module. Every single framework that we're about to look at, each principle and each regulation really does exist in light of experiences like these. So first, let's think about community engagement. Community engagement is not binary. It is not that you are community engaged or not community engaged. Instead, it really is a continuum. And where you fall on it really depends on how the power and the decision making about your research is shared. So on the far left, you can see investigator-driven research. Here, the researcher sets the agenda. The community is essentially a subject pool. So maybe you would recruit from a particular neighborhood, but in reality, the questions and the design and the analysis and even the idea for the research in the first place, all of that really lives with the academic team. One step over is community-placed research. This idea is that the research happens in the community physically, but it's not really with the community. Here, the researcher has moved geographically, but not relationally. Community-based research goes even further than this. Here, community input shapes the design and the recruitment. So here you're asking, you're listening, and you're adjusting based on what you hear. Community-based participatory research, or what we label CBPR, is what most people really think of as a gold standard. Here you're seeking to achieve an equitable partnership where decisions are really shared back and forth throughout the research lifecycle. On the far right is community-driven research. This here is where the community actually sets the priorities and then researchers serve the agenda. Here, the community says, we need to understand X, and in response, the researchers bring their methodological expertise to help answer X. So 2 things I want you to take away. First, none of these is automatically wrong. There are good reasons for a particular study to be investigator-driven. This is clear. Second, we need to know that the goal is not always to be at the far right. So the goal is to be honest about where you are and intentional about why you're there. This continuum was developed by Sabun Winkler at Harvard Catalyst and has been presented at an OHRP conference in 2011, and ever since then it's been pretty widely adopted. Great, so let's spend some time with CBPR, community-based participatory research. This is, as I mentioned, one of the most influential frameworks in the field. You might have heard about it before. You'll definitely see it referenced regularly in proposals and in papers and even in IRB conversations. It's attributed to multiple scholars, but it has significant contributions by really Barbara Israel and Meredith Minkler in the United States. It emerged in the 1980s and into the 1990s, and really it has 9 formal principles, which we'll see on the subsequent slide. These were published in the Annual Review of Public Health, and it's still considered a canonical reference in the field. So CBPR really positions itself around 3 things. First, it's a partnership approach to research, so not data extraction, really seeking true collaboration. You're not studying the community in this case, you're really working with and alongside them. Second, it seeks to really equitably involve community members and organizations and academic researchers. And in this case, equitability is really the key word. Each partner should be recognized as bringing essential expertise that the other partner doesn't have. So the community brings its lived experience and its contextual knowledge, and then the academic community brings methodological training, but in this case, neither is really more important than the other. Third, all partners in this framework contribute and share decision making. Again, power is distributed across the full research cycle, from defining the question through the design into recruitment, analysis, and dissemination. This isn't just about, dissemination at the end or recruitment at the beginning. It's really that the decisions about all aspects of the research are integrated across the key players. If a partnership shares power early and then takes it back at the analysis stage, that is not CBPR. There's also consideration for the reality about the decisions of what gets published and what doesn't, and also decisions about money, who gets paid and how much. So these are the 9 principles from Israel and colleagues, and I'll just walk through them quickly. Certainly you don't need to memorize them, but I want you to at least hear them once. So first is principle 1, and that's equal partnership and power sharing. We just covered this mostly, but power will flow through every stage. 2 is that the community as an identity unit. Here, the community itself, not just its individuals, are recognized, as having an identity worth respecting and protecting. 3 is the building on the community's strengths. This is an asset-based approach. It's not deficit-based. So you're not coming in to fix a broken community. You're really working with a community that has deep knowledge, deep networks, and its own capacity. 4 is co-learning and capacity building. Here, both partners learn. The academic learns about the community, and the community learns about research. Both are stronger at the end. 5 is the ecological health approach. Here, health is shaped by what we know as social, economic, environmental, and political factors, and it's not just a biological perspective. CBPR will take a systems view. 6, we're looking to really balance research and action. So the research has to lead somewhere, and findings without action will really betray our partnership. Number 7 is inclusive dissemination. Findings will go back to the community in a usable form, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. 8 is long-term commitment. So CBPR is not a one-grant relationship. The partner should really outlive any single study. Ideally, it would start before a study starts, and it will end long after the study ends. 9 is cultural humility and social justice. The work should be grounded in an explicit commitment to ensuring that all people are engaged in the work, and the academic partner approaches the community with humility, not expertise as an authority. Please note that these are not just methodological principles. These are really ethical commitments, and that CBPR is a values-based framework as much as it really is a research framework. So I want to pause a little bit on this slide because the words are really worth hearing. This is from a quote from Orlando Falls-Borda, who was a Colombian sociologist who co-founded participatory action research. We're going to move into that theory sort of framework next. He wrote this as a charge to researchers. Quote, "Do not monopolize your knowledge, nor impose arrogantly your techniques, but respect and combine your skills with the knowledge of the researched or grassroots communities taking them as full partners and co-researchers. Do not depend solely on your culture to interpret facts, but recover local values, traits, beliefs, and arts for action by and with the research organizations. Do not impose your own ponderous scientific style for communicating results, but diffuse and share what you have learned together with the people in a manner that is wholly understandable. For science should not be necessarily a mystery, nor a monopoly of experts and intellectuals. So 3 do nots, 3 reframings. Don't monopolize knowledge, try to combine it. Think a lot about dissemination and communication. Try not to depend solely on your perspective, but seek to recover local values, whether that be through actual connection with community members or with other stakeholders and practitioners. And then last, be careful not to impose your scientific style. The idea, again, is to diffuse and share. I think this is one of the most beautiful articulations of what community engaged research is really asking of us. It's asking us to soften, not lower, our scientific standards and to be honest about whose knowledge counts in a way that's really more inclusive. All right, so let's turn to participatory action research. Participatory action research is very closely related to CBPR, and sometimes people do use the terms interchangeably, but they do have different origins and emphasis. So PAR, as they call it, traces back to Kurt Lewin in the 1930s, and it is closely connected to that work of Orlando Falls Borda, who we just heard from. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator as well, is attributed with really contributing to this line of thinking as well. Lewin's early studies were striking. Initially, he went into factories and he challenged the dominant top-down management approach by showing that democratic structures, where workers participated in decisions about their own work, actually improved productivity and morale. So these same principles got applied to neighborhoods and communities, and in this way, participatory action research became a recognized methodology in the 1970s. PAR's goal is to be collective and to encourage self-reflective inquiry. So here, participants are actually co-investigators, right? We're taking this to a little bit of a next level. They're not considered subjects. Here, the line between researcher and researched is deliberately blurred. Second, reflection here is really linked to action. So in PAR, we see this embedded in the history and culture and local context and in the way that these social relationships develop. Here, you can't necessarily pull the data out of a situation that produced it. So it's really embedded. And then third, this is a distinguishing feature. The point of PAR is social action. So this isn't just research for research's sake, it's research to instigate social action. CBPR really balances research and action, whereas PAR is really centered in action. Research here is a means where community-defined change is the end. So if you ever hear anyone say that PAR is a more activist cousin of CBPR, that's probably pretty close. Both are participatory, but PAR is really more openly committed to changing the situation, not just understanding it. So here's 3 things that really set participatory action research apart methodologically. If you're going to read the literature, it's good to know these kind of distinctions. So first is the idea of reflective cycles. PAR doesn't run in a single straight line from question to answer. The idea is that it's an iterative loop, and participants collect data, they analyze it together, then they decide what action follows. Then they research the action itself and reflect it and then go back around again. So here the research is kind of alive and it's truly embedded in this idea of action orientation. Another key distinguishing factor is power and relationships. Here, participatory action research is deliberately attuned to power dynamics. Questions like who gets to even ask the question? Who gets to interpret the answers? Whose voice will end up in the published version? PAR really rejects a positivist paradigm, the idea that there's some kind of objective researcher floating above a situation, and instead it really replaces it with a relational, co-constructed view of science. Third, PAR really separates itself from other paradigms by understanding that context is really inseparable from data. PAR refuses to separate subjects from their context, and it recognizes that data is dynamic. It can't be extracted from the lived realities of people who produce it. If you take a quote out of its setting in this way, you've really changed what it means. So the underpinnings of all three, power and empowerment, participation, and lived experience, as well as critical reflection on our practice and even our own culture and our own biases and assumptions, are what we really bring to PAR. Okay, so that kind of concludes our conversation about key underlying theories. And now I'm going to move on to ethics. So I'm going to start with the Fraser quote that's at the top of this slide that says, collaboration is less an option than an ethical obligation. And that's really quite a strong statement, which we're going to unpack here a little bit. So most of us probably learned research ethics through the Belmont Report, right? We're familiar with the idea of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. We know that those frameworks were articulated back in 1979 in response to some other abuses and past historical situations that resulted in, unethical behavior. And we know now that those were designed to protect individual research subjects. As we think, though, about community engaged research, some other ethical issues can start to arise, and it really can ask us to widen our frame. So within these same three principles, we still will operate, but then we'll also have some additional questions that come to bear. So let's think for a minute about respect for persons. Standard application is that informed consent from each participant is appropriate. In community engaged research, we might also ask, though, how is the community consent obtained? And in addition to individual consent, is there community leaders involved in recruitment? Are there conflicts of interest that may affect participation really at this broader community level? So these kinds of questions are also now starting to be brought to bear. If we think about beneficence, our standard application, of course, is how do we maximize the benefits, minimize the risks for the participant? If we're thinking about it in terms of community engaged research, we might also want to consider the risk and benefit at another level. First to the individual, but then also potentially to the individual by virtue of their association with a group, thinking a little bit more at the community level, thinking about how we weigh the risks of disseminating sensitive data back to the community and what the implications are for communities as a whole. If we think about justice, of course, our standard application is fair selection of subjects, but we can also think about it in terms of community engaged research and how we're defining the community, who counts as a community leader, and thinking a little bit more about these criteria that might shape who is actually included in the research and also who isn't. On the right side of the slide, you can see the 4 C's of ethical community-based research. This is from an article produced in 2013. Thinking more about community significance, does the research address what the community actually identifies as important? Thinking about community collaboration, do partners genuinely shape the design and the interpretation of the results and the study itself? Thinking about the community return, are these findings actually getting shared back, and are they getting shared back in a usable form? Last is community control. Does the community actually have a meaningful authority over these research decisions, or is this authority really largely symbolic? So one topic that we could probably spend a whole nother lecture thinking about is privacy and confidentiality within the community engaged research lens. It can be a lot harder more complex, I guess, to operate, because when community members serve as researchers, they're really engaged in recruitment and consenting and also collecting data. They may know the people that they're working with. They might be neighbors, and so that can really change things. Sometimes participants may not feel as free to disclose sensitive information to someone that they see at the grocery store every day, or at the same time, they might feel a little more likely because they can, relate. So this can affect confidentiality and data quality. There are some strategies that people bring to bear to kind of address this. Um, these are all listed across the bottom of the slide. So if we think about recruitment, we want to have the potential participants contact, ideally, a study team member directly, rather than being approached by a friend or a neighbor on staff, or integrate that element into the process where you kind of maybe sign up for the study. And in that way, the participant can choose whether to engage in sort of a secondary layer. Um, Thinking about the setting of the research and where they might engage with you, such as a public meeting hall, library, or community center, can be a strength, but you might also want to be careful about posting something in a hyper visible way that names a topic, and then maybe follows up in that same setting as to what you're doing there. You may also want to offer participants the choice between a home visit and a public meetup, or a more discreet location, even in a public place, as opposed to something more open, especially when you're doing recruitment. Thinking a little bit too about data collection and how that occurs, whether or not the individual themselves put their data into like a portable device, a tablet or a phone or something. That might preserve privacy as long as literacy is an issue, or comprehensive, making sure that what you're being asked is easy to understand, doesn't require a facilitator. So we also might want to really think about data collectors who are geographically aligned, but maybe not exactly from the same community that you're studying. So we're like same region, maybe different neighborhood, that kind of thing. We also need to think a little bit about the training that goes into this kind of work, making sure that data security training, storage, access, protocols in general are sort of tested. You might do mock scenarios and really work through this with everyone who's part of the study team, including the community engaged members as well. So getting into regulation a bit can be overwhelming, to be honest, but just to familiarize you with a little bit of this work, it does have some practical consequences for timeline, budget, and also just understanding of how this kind of works. So if your study is supported by direct federal funding, which includes most NIH grants, of course, and it involves a community partner organization, oftentimes that partner can be held to the same regulatory requirements for human subjects protections that we in universities are. So there's a couple of ways that works out. You might have an IRB reliance agreement. That would be something where the nonprofit or community partner would actually rely on your IRB. It's a pretty common path for academic community partnerships. And they're aligned with that is something called an FWA, or a federal wide assurance, where there's an institution that holds that credential. So, universities all hold it. Some nonprofits do also. It's not actually that hard to achieve, but typically it is on the academic side. And that will help to extend the coverage of that federal wide assurance over to the community partner. And then the partner can rely on that institution's IRB for review and also for continuing oversight and so forth. So if you're going to have community-based partners who are involved in recruitment, outreach, perhaps less so dissemination, but if they're collecting data or engaged in recruitment, then they really do need to be part of the IRB protocol, which also means then that they are going to need to complete CITI training. This can be a challenge for a lot of community settings. I've done CITI trainings over the course of a day, and then we sort of go through the key elements of the Belmont report and a lot of the elements we've discussed here briefly. so that community members have a chance to have dialogue and discuss it before they actually go on to that, what can be kind of overwhelming CITI training online. Sometimes community organizations do have their own IRB, and sometimes these larger groups will go, and use their own IRB as well. And then sometimes you have to, consider whether their IRB and our IRB will get along. So that can take a little bit more time. Last, you can also just have an individual investigator agreement where the partner organization wouldn't have a federal-wide assurance or necessarily an IRB, but we would just have an agreement between the community member and our research team if it's a smaller group where the primary institution's IRB would be responsible. Again, if CITI is needed, that would have to come through the primary institution. So training community partners is another element that any PI would need to undertake if they were engaging more community engaged work. This can come, across a continuum. It's not that you just, train and are done, but thinking about training, thinking about what you're offering and what they are going to be training you on also in some ways is really helpful. So fundamentally, when it comes to ethics and regulations, the community engaged partner needs to be basically trained on human subject protection, as I mentioned with CITI. And that would assume that a particular level of literacy and comfort with technology, some familiarity with scientific terminology for sure. And so in some ways, like I mentioned, you might need to go through sort of a special second effort to make sure that all the language is understandable and people conceptually understand what you're talking about. We need it to be culturally appropriate, and we need to be able to essentially ensure that this isn't fostering an expanded power dynamic as part of the integration. All right, so I want to slow down a little bit for this slide because it really does ask something of us that some of the regulatory slides overlook. On the left, you can see a confession from Danielle Dick. This was published in 2017. And she writes, I will start with a confession. I was a tenured professor with well over 100 publications before I ever thought much about research participants. For me, research subjects were an N in a methods section. I was not really concerned about whether that N was large enough to provide sufficient power to address the scientific question. I really appreciated her honesty when I read this, and I think it's really not a unique experience for a lot of people. Many of us were trained in a paradigm where the participants were functionally data endpoints. And I think this conversation about community engaged research really does ask us to do something different and asks us to consider our own positionality, who we are and what power we hold, what experiences we do and don't have access to, and how all of that can kind of shape our understanding of the research, the design, and so forth itself. So 5 themes really come up over and over in this literature. These are on the right. So first, we see marginalization within academia that shapes the questions that even count as research questions. Here we know that the questions that can get funded could reflect who's even at the table and who's not at the table. Another is creating safe spaces for dialogue. This really is an ongoing effort. It's an extra job. Sometimes it's not really what's captured in our P&T, but it's a reality for the ethics of doing this work well. It's not a one-time event. It's the idea of not just having a kickoff meeting, declaring everyone is trusting, and then maybe touching base again at the dissemination phase to ask them to spread the word about a paper that's coming out. Third, we know that scholars of color may experience their own knowledge being marginalized by the academy. The community engaged researcher who is also a person of color may carry a double labor with this intersectionality that white researchers frankly do not. And keeping this in mind can be very important. Fourth, we know writing, representation, and publication itself reflect power and privilege. Thinking about whose name goes first on a paper and who gets credit is deeply embedded in this concept. Fifth, we know that utilitarian and social justice worldviews can clash in research design with the idea of trying to achieve maximum benefit for the most people versus really addressing structural inequity for the most marginalized. And these really lead to different kinds of methodological choices. The paper from 2015 in Critical Sociology is another place you can read more on this, and it's a great paper. It's worth the time. So now we're on to dissemination. And I think this is one of the last big practical topics, and one that we often sort of discuss lightly, but might be deprioritized because it's coming when the grant is winding down, everyone's tired. You might have published your primary paper. But the principle is really in the green box here. Community engaged research places particular emphasis on returning findings to the communities involved, and that return should really be in a way that's easily understood. We want to return things to local government agencies, to policymakers, and to other parties who can actually go ahead and translate the findings into change. This is the idea of translational research, of course. So in this way, dissemination is not really the final chapter of a research project. It's really part of the research plan from the very beginning. And in this way, you should be talking about how the findings will get back to the community in your proposal, not in the no-cost extension or later on after the study is done. There's a couple of different channels we think about. Community forums, right? In that case, you want to have plain language briefings, trusted local venues, town halls, maybe community events around certain conditions, faith spaces, schools and libraries, things like that. You also have the opportunity for co-created materials. These could be infographics, brochures, frequently asked questions, opportunities for the community member itself to present the findings, co-developed with the partners, test them for clarity, double check it looks right, people understand what the words are that are in there, there's no jargon. Policy briefs. So this is another one where we're starting to think about translating findings and sending it to local government, legislators, program directors. Sharing information about study findings is not lobbying, and you're welcome to connect with a policy brief to provide information about a subject matter that might be relevant for policymakers. Last is the peer-reviewed output. Of course, this is very common. We want to think, though, about co-authoring journal articles and co-authoring conference talks that actually name the community contributors as authors when their contributions warrant it, of course. Co-authorship is a meaningful forum of dissemination, both for the field and for partnership. So think about this when you're putting together your proposal and, of course, when you're activating your research. All right, so we have covered a lot of ground. I want to acknowledge something. Most of the published examples of community engaged research, they tend to be gold standard. These are fully built partnerships. We've talked a lot about gold standard CBPR, gold standard PAR, even photo voice. I'm sure some of you are thinking, this has nothing to do with the work I do. I don't even know how to apply this. And it's true. A lot of the research that out there is gold standard, but I really want to double down with where we started. This idea that it is a continuum, and there are elements of the values and ethics of CBPR and PAR that really can connect to the work anyone does. The idea about authorship, dissemination, understanding the context for how your science will be used, and understanding it early on is really part of the goal. If you're a basic scientist who's really never done anything like that before, I can understand that it would feel intimidating. Perhaps this seems like a high bar or even irrelevant, but I want to encourage you to think that community engagement is this continuum, and that there really are these meaningful steps that you can take, and you can even start tomorrow. Here's a couple ideas that we have. Try to start communicating without jargon. Think about what you're studying. Think about why it matters, and think if you can say it in 2 sentences or so for a neighbor who could actually understand it. What's your elevator pitch, if you will, that just describes the purpose of your research and why it's relevant for me? If not, take a minute to work on it. That is itself an element toward moving toward community engagement work. Second, think about how you frame your research in terms of a community benefit. Think to yourself, why does this matter to me? Or why does this matter to my family? And lead with that. Start by thinking about what it means for the community member or the patient who's impacted, more so than starting with your methods alone. 3, try to show up to aligned groups. It might be a physician forum or it might be a patient group. But try to identify some advocacy groups or organizations that are active in your particular topic area and go attend a meeting. Try to listen. Eventually think about becoming a member or even a guest speaker. 4th, try to attend some community events, science festivals, lab days, public demonstrations. Try to continue this idea of putting faces on your samples, on your ends, and make yourself reachable. 5th, work toward co-creating educational content. You might want to host a webinar or make a video, co-write some frequently asked questions with community members rather than for community members, and try to, think more about that balance. 6th, think about building an advisory board. Advisory boards can be very influential because once you start to build a relationship, you can ask them ad hoc questions as well as formal questions. And here, community members can be involved who will potentially challenge the way that you're saying something or doing it, but also through that refinement will continue to ground your work and really improve it. Make sure you pay community members for their time, build that into the grant in advance. We don't want to have funding issues where people are uncompensated for the work that they do. And so you have to build it into the budget. So I challenge you, go ahead and try 1 or 2 of these this month or next month. Think about this as you're building your proposals and the basic foundations and philosophies that we've talked about. I'm going to close today with some additional resources and examples. I want to point you to some that are available now. Definitely go check out our Delaware CTR website. Just do ACCEL CTR. It will pop right up. There's a number of resources on there. Some of these links might get moved around over the years, of course, but many of them will be still available. They're local. Think about our community partner directory, also a list of organizations that are already engaged with our network. But if you really want to talk to someone, we do have free research consulting services around community engagement. All you have to do is if you're working on a proposal or you just have an idea, or maybe I've intrigued some thinking for you, even though you're a bench scientist, to really wonder, how do I really make an advisory board? Like, who would I reach out to? How do I do that? Or how do I really think about more community engagement in terms of dissemination of my findings? Or I just want to be a resource for the community because I really am an expert in, sickle cell. How do I become more involved here in Delaware because I just moved here from New York or something? Please take a moment to reach out to us. You can just request a consult and we're happy to connect with you, and you can do all that right on the community engagement webpage on ACCEL CTR. We also have a community research exchange, which is an annual meeting, and we really encourage you to attend, to think about presenting your work there or a poster presentation. We typically have a variety of partners that come to that meeting, and so please keep that on your radar screen. It usually happens in the fall every year. Know too that we have a community advisory council. I've mentioned their participation in this content earlier, but our community advisory council serves the ACCEL program, and the folks there provide lived experience input on study design, and really sort of iterative feedback on the way that we approach community engagement across the ACCEL CTR program. I also just want to mention the DSU IHER CED core. I know, a lot of letters. This is Delaware State University's Institute for Health Equity Research, which also provides community engagement and dissemination support. And then on the right, I have some other resources. We have the Yale CBPR guidebook, which is comprehensive and free, and it's online. There's the NIH glossary of terms. And of course, I already mentioned the CITI programs community engagement module, which has also informed parts of this training and is available through citiprogram.org. There's other guidance documents about federal-wide assurance and IRB and so forth, also on the OHRP website and the work that they do. And finally, here are some references from the citations and a lot of the content that I shared with you today. I'm not going to read them aloud, of course, but feel free to go here if you'd like to learn about more. I will highlight the Barbara Israel paper that is the foundation of CBPR principles. And also, I discussed a little bit more about human subjects protections in community engaged research by Ross. There's also the CITI program module. So thank you for your time and attention. I know this has been a lot of time today, and the fact that you're still sitting through this hour-long training on community engagement is really a testament that you take this seriously. I thank you for your attention, and I really hope that you're able to take home and take away some of these suggestions and frameworks and think about it more in terms of your own work. Please, too, if you have questions, reach out to Delaware CTR ACCEL. My name is Allison Carpin. I work at the University of Delaware, and we really are here to help. So take care and thank you.